There are archaeological sites whose value is measured in the volume of gold recovered or the condition of their frescoes. The walls of Troy, of Ilion, belong to an entirely different order. They are not simply a fortification system from antiquity. They are a monumental threshold dividing historical reality from the greatest epic humanity has ever produced. For millennia these walls remained invisible, buried under layer upon layer of accumulated centuries inside the hill of Hazarlik in northwestern Turkey. They existed only in Homer's hexameters, in the imagination of poets and artists and obsessives who believed the Iliad was not a fairy tale. When Heinrich Schliemann drove his spade into the earth at Hazarlik in the 19th century, guided by a blind faith in the literal truth of Homer's text, he was looking for them. The high, sheer, impregnable walls against which the Achaean assault had broken. What emerged from a century and a half of excavation proved to be far more complex, more tangled, and more monumental than any legend. Troy, it turned out, was not one city but a layered cake of 9 major archaeological periods spanning more than 3,000 years. And almost every one of those periods left its mark in stone. The walls of Troy are a chronicle of the evolution of ancient military engineering across the Bronze and Iron Ages, the story of how human beings tamed raw stone, how they struggled against the seismic violence of Anatolia, and how they created symbols of power capable of outlasting the empires that built them. To understand how the walls of Troy were built and how they function, one must understand the phenomenon of the tell. The artificial mound formed by centuries of continuous human occupation. The hill of Hazarlik, whose name in Turkish means, the place where a fortress stands, was ideally suited for fortification. It rose above the plain, commanding the strategically vital passage between the Aegean Sea and the Propontis, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles Strait. Each time the city was destroyed by fire, earthquake, or war, the new inhabitants did not clear the rubble back to bedrock. They leveled the ruins, covered them with earth, and built their new walls directly on top of the old ones. The ground level rose with every generation. Archaeologists today distinguish 9 major layers, Troy I through Troy IX, many of which divide further into sub-periods, each representing a distinct phase of construction and habitation spanning from roughly 3000 BCE to 500 CE. Troy I, dating to around 3000 to 2550 BCE, was a small citadel of the early Bronze Age, roughly 100 meters in diameter, its walls built from rough uncut stone and sun-dried mud brick with massive towers flanking the gates. Troy II, from approximately 2550 to 2300 BCE, the period of the so-called Treasure of Priam, saw the citadel expand significantly, its walls now raised on a stone socle with a pronounced outward slope, the glacis, and a mud brick parapet above. Periods Troy III through V, spanning roughly 2300 to 1750 BCE, represent phases of relative contraction and rebuilding, with dense urban fabric pressing close against the fortification lines. Then came Troy VI, the Golden Age of Ilion, from about 1750 to 1300 BCE, whose magnificent walls of dressed limestone with their famous stepped profile and projecting towers represent the peak of Bronze Age military architecture in the Aegean world and the strongest candidate for Homer's Troy. Troy VIIA, from around 1300 to 1180 BCE, followed a catastrophic earthquake. The walls of Troy VI were hastily repaired and reinforced, new elements added, and the rebuilt city eventually perished in a conflagration consistent with violent assault. Finally, Troy VIII and IX, from around 700 BCE to 500 CE, saw the site transformed into Hellenistic and Roman Ilion, with a new temple of Athena, marble cladding over the ancient limestone, and the preservation of key Bronze Age wall sections as monuments for pilgrims. Already in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, Troy II announces itself as a major proto-state center. Its walls were the first triumph of local constructive thinking. The foundation consisted of massive stone blocks laid without mortar. Above them rose a superstructure of sun-dried mud brick. The defining innovation was the glacis, the sloping outer face of the wall. This served 2 purposes simultaneously. Structurally, an inclined wall distributes its own weight more effectively and resists the lateral pressure of the fill within the mound. Militarily, it was nearly impossible to undermine with the primitive siege tools of the period, and attackers attempting to scale it were forced to climb an angled surface under a continuous rain of arrows and stones from the defenders above. The gateways of Troy too deserve particular attention. They were designed with a deliberate tactical cruelty. Their L-shaped or P-shaped approach passages forced anyone entering the city to present their right side, the side unprotected by a shield, to the defenders stationed on the wooden galleries above. This fortress died in a catastrophic fire, leaving behind bricks fused solid by temperatures of extraordinary intensity and the treasures that Schliemann, too impatient to be careful, announced to the world as the treasure of Priam, though they predated any plausible Priam by more than 1,000 years. Troy 6 is where one stops in genuine awe. Its builders abandoned rough stone entirely in favor of carefully dressed blocks of dense shell limestone, laid with a precision that allows no blade to pass between them. The walls of this period display several features of striking engineering sophistication. Their outer face is not a smooth vertical surface but a series of slight offsets. Every 9 to 10 meters the wall steps inward by 10 to 15 centimeters. Seen from above, the wall traces a gentle zigzag rather than a clean arc. This was not an error. The offsets compensated for the curvature of the hilltop, absorbed seismic vibrations during earthquakes by preventing continuous cracks from propagating along the full length of the wall, and created projecting angles from which defenders could direct flanking fire against attackers who had reached the base. The lower section of the wall, the socle, rising 4 to 5 meters, leans slightly inward, producing a massive battered base that widens toward the ground, then transitions to a vertical inner face, creating a structure that combines maximum stability with maximum interior floor space. The towers of Troy 6 were enormous rectangular projections, the most formidable being the northeast tower, more than 9 meters wide, its stone base still standing over 7 meters high today, commanding a panoramic view of the entire Trojan plain and the course of the river Scamander. The walls of Troy 6 and VIIA were pierced by several gateways, each designed as an independent defensive node. The south gate served as the main ceremonial entrance to the citadel. The road approaching it ran at an angle, forcing any attacker to move along the wall with their right side exposed. The gateway itself was compressed between the main wall and a massive eastern tower. Immediately before the south gate, archaeologists uncovered stone bases for Baetyls, sacred standing stones that represented the gods who protected the city, most likely Apollo Aegeus, guardian of roads and entrances. The military architecture and the religious cult were inseparable. The walls defended the city not only physically but sacrally, with divine force embedded in the very stone. In addition to the main gates, the walls of Troy contained small concealed exits, posterns, used for surprise sorties against besieging forces or for secure internal communication during an assault. Their construction required exact calculation to avoid compromising the load-bearing capacity of the surrounding masonry. In Greek mythology, the walls of Troy carry their own sacred biography. According to tradition, the Trojan king Laomedon, father of Priam, commissioned walls of unprecedented strength. Zeus sent the gods Poseidon and Apollo, temporarily in disgrace, to perform the labor, joined by the mortal hero Aeacus. Poseidon cut and laid the great stone blocks with his own hands, giving the walls their indestructible foundation. Apollo tended Laomedon's flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida and, in some versions, helped bind the stones together through divine harmony, through the organizing power of music itself. But Laomedon proved treacherous. When the work was done, he refused to pay and threatened to cut off the god's ears. The offended Poseidon sent a sea monster against the Trojan coast, Apollo sent plague. The myth contains a crucial structural metaphor. Because the mortal Aeacus had participated in the construction, the section of wall he had built, on the western slope, according to the tradition, remained mortal and therefore vulnerable. Through that specific section, the seers foretold, the enemy would eventually break through. Homer acknowledges this in the Iliad, noting that the two Ajaxes repeatedly targeted precisely that stretch of wall as more accessible to arrows and blows. The divine origin of the walls is thus also the explanation of their ultimate failure, immortal strength built by mortal hands contains, from its first stone, the seed of its own destruction. The principal question has always been which Troy fell to the Greeks and what destroyed it. The main candidates remain Troy 6 and Troy VIA. The excavations of Carl Blegen in the 1930s revealed that the magnificent Troy 6 perished around 1300 BCE not from enemy assault but from a violent tectonic event. Deep fractures in the stone walls, massive blocks displaced from their courses, upper sections of towers collapsed inward. This finding offers a remarkable rationalization of the Trojan horse. The horse is the sacred animal of Poseidon, god of the sea and of earthquakes, the earth shaker. It is entirely possible that Greek forces exploited a breach caused by seismic damage. Equally possible that the image of the horse became a poetic metaphor for the battering ram, or for the earthquake itself, which shattered the God-built walls by the agency of their own divine architect. Troy VIA tells a different story. After the earthquake disaster, the inhabitants returned, hastily patching the broken walls of Troy 6 with cruder masonry. The character of the city changed. The interior space was packed densely with small houses whose floors were sunk with enormous storage vessels, pithoi, filled with grain and oil. The city was preparing for a long siege and had drawn in the population of the surrounding countryside behind its walls. Around 1180 BCE this Troy burned. Everywhere archaeologists find thick ash layers, charred human remains on the streets, and arrowheads embedded in the stonework. The date coincides precisely with the Great Bronze Age collapse and the movements of the Sea Peoples. The walls had held the siege. The city was destroyed from within, by hunger, by fire, by something that breached not the stone but the endurance of those behind it. After the fall of Mycenaean civilization, Troy lay in ruins for generations. But its walls continued to draw the greatest figures of the ancient world. For Greeks and Romans alike, Ilion was a sacred city. The cradle of their own cultural identity, the origin point of the myth that explained who they were. The Romans traced their descent from the Trojan Aeneas, which made the ruins of Troy not a foreign monument but a national shrine. When Alexander the Great landed in Asia in 334 BCE, his first act was to visit Troy. He made sacrifice in the temple of Athena, ran naked around the burial mound of his ancestor Achilles, and ordered the city exempted from tribute and its fortifications rebuilt. Caesar and Augustus later initiated major reconstructions of the site, cutting back some of the Bronze Age strata to create flat terraces for a temple complex and an odeum, cladding the ancient limestone in marble, but preserving the most significant sections of the old walls as monuments for the streams of pilgrims and travelers from across the Mediterranean who came to stand before what they called the remains of the Tower of Priam. The walls of Troy underwent a unique cultural evolution across their 3,000 years. They began as a practical instrument of survival and domination in a wealthy Bronze Age region. They developed into an engineering masterpiece that anticipated seismic engineering principles not formally understood until the modern era. And they passed into the body of world literature as the symbol of an insurmountable barrier of loyalty, tragedy, and the collision between human ambition and human limitation. These walls witnessed the pride of Laomedon, the tears of Andromache, Hector's farewell to his son, the rage of Achilles, and the cunning of Odysseus. They stood on the frontier between East and West, absorbing the blows of successive civilizations. And even in ruin, the walls of Troy defeated time, proving that the most durable fortification is built not only from limestone and brick, but from human memory, which no fire has ever managed to burn.